Hello, friends. There are events that are hard to believe, yet they happen for real. These are stories about people who survived against all odds, and about things that science cannot always explain. We have gathered 30 stories that will turn your perception of reality upside down. If you enjoy this format, please like and comment on which city you are listening from. This greatly helps in building our community. Are you ready? Let's get started. Story number 1. The Rider of the Storm Apocalypse. It was a muggy July day in 1959. Lieutenant Colonel William Rankin, an experienced Marine Corps pilot, was ascending into the sky over North Carolina. He felt in control, sitting in the cockpit of his supersonic fighter jet. The sky appeared endless and safe, while below, clouds billowed like whipped cream. William had no idea that in just a few minutes, this peaceful landscape would turn into the most sophisticated torture chamber nature could create. Rankin was flying at an altitude of 47,000 feet, nearly 15 kilometers above the Earth. He was above the weather, but right below him loomed a monstrous storm front. The tops of the clouds grazed the fuselage of his aircraft. At that moment, when the pilot was completely relaxed, the sensors flashed red. The engine stalled. The whine of the turbine gave way to an ominous grinding noise. The plane became a falling stone. Restart attempts were futile. William had no choice but to pull the ejection lever. In that instant, he made a fatal error he would instantly regret. He left the plane without a pressurized suit, at an altitude where the temperature was minus 50 degrees, and the air was so thin that blood could boil. The air blast from the ejection was so forceful that it tore off his glove and watch. His body immediately swelled from decompression. His abdomen ballooned, ready to burst. But that was just the beginning. According to calculations, the free fall before the parachute deployed should have taken only a few minutes. However, William was not falling to the ground. He was falling directly into the maw of a gigantic storm cloud. As soon as the parachute opened, Rankin realized he was trapped. Instead of gently descending, he was violently yanked upwards. The updrafts of hot air within the storm lifted him like a feather. He found himself in a gigantic atmospheric elevator, tossing him up and down at racetrack speeds. Hell unfurled around him. Lightning did not strike far away. It struck right next to him. William later described it as blue blades cutting through the darkness. The thunder roared with such intensity that he felt the vibration in every bone of his body. The rain was so dense that the pilot struggled to breathe. He had to hold his breath to avoid drowning in the air several kilometers high, and then the rain turned to hail. Ice stones pounded his helmet and body, leaving bruises and scrapes. He was tossed around in this icy and electric hell for what felt like an eternity. He lost consciousness from the pain and G-forces, regained his senses from the cold, and again lost his orientation. He thought he was already dead. Time stretched on. By the laws of physics, he should have landed a long time ago, but the storm wouldn't let go of its toy. Finally, the updraft weakened. The exhausted, frostbitten body of the pilot began to descend. He tumbled out from the lower edge of the clouds and crashed into the forest. When he looked at the miracle-survived watch on his second hand, he couldn't believe his eyes. His descent took not 10 minutes as it should have, but 40 minutes. 40 minutes inside the thundercloud, without protection among lightning and vacuum. William Rankin didn't just survive. He stood up, made it to the road, and hitchhiked. The doctors who examined him later couldn't explain how his body endured such stresses. He became the man who literally rode the storm, and came back to tell the tale. The force of nature released him, but our next story will take us from the raging skies to a place of absolute, ringing silence. And the danger comes not from nature, but from human ingenuity, cornered. Story number 2. The Day the Earth Went Hungry. Imagine a morning woven from tranquility. Louisiana, November 20th, 1980. Lake Piner. A picturesque body of water, a favorite spot for local fishermen. The water here is fresh, shallow, only about 3 meters deep. The bottom is sandy and the shores are lush with greenery, where rare species of iris bloom. It was an idyllic scene, like a postcard, that seemed destined to last forever. None of the locals could have anticipated that their familiar landscape was living its final hours and would soon be erased from the face of the earth, not by an atomic bomb and not by an earthquake, but by a simple miscalculation. In the center of the lake stood an oil rig. The oil workers were searching for black gold, drilling into the bottom, while deep below them, at a depth of 400 meters, another team was at work, miners extracting salt. It was a strange yet peaceful coexistence. One group drilled from above, while the other dug from below. The engineering audacity that seemed safe all changed when the oil drill suddenly got stuck. The workers tried to free it, but heard a series of loud, terrifying pops. The platform began to tilt. People frantically dashed to the lifeboats, feeling the massive steel structure beneath them start to sink into the water. They managed to row to a safe distance and turned back to witness the unimaginable. The rig, as tall as a 15-story building, disappeared into the murky water so quickly that it seemed an invisible hand of a giant tugged it along. But that was just the beginning of the disaster. It turned out that the engineers had miscalculated the coordinates. The drill pierced the roof of the salt mine. The hole was tiny, only 35 centimeters in diameter, but the high-pressure water from the lake surged into the mine, instantly dissolving the salt. The small hole transformed within minutes into a giant sinkhole, an insatiable mouth that began to devour everything around it. The quiet lake morphed into the largest whirlpool ever seen by man, far from the ocean. The vortex expanded at a terrifying speed. It sucked in the second drilling rig. Then a dog sank beneath the waves. 11 barsh followed him, swirling in that hellish dance like toy boats in a bathtub before vanishing into the abyss. The ground along the shores began to collapse. The whirlpool devoured 65 acres of reeds, a winter garden, and a residential house. The most incredible events unfolded underground. There were 55 people in the mine. When the water began flooding the galleries, the lights went out, and a hurricane-force wind surged. The air was displaced by water with such force that it knocked people off their feet. The miners accomplished the impossible. In complete darkness, relying only on memory and instinct, they made their way to the elevator. The lift, creaking under the load, brought them to the surface just moments before the mine was completely submerged. Chaos reigned above ground. The Delcambre Canal, which had always flowed from the lake to the Gulf of Mexico, suddenly changed its course. The power of the whirlpool was such that it drew in water from the ocean. For the first time in history, a temporary waterfall 50 meters high formed on the plain. The ocean poured into the empty basin of the former lake. 2 days later, when the pressure equalized, Lake Penor returned. But it was no longer the same lake. From fresh water, it had turned salty. Its depth increased from 3 meters to 400. From its depths, like corks from champagne bottles, the same 11 barsh that had been swallowed earlier were ejected. They were propelled by compressed air. This event was nothing short of a miracle. Despite the total destruction of the ecosystem and the loss of massive infrastructure, no one perished. Neither the miners, nor the oil workers, nor the fishermen whose boat had been sucked into the mud were harmed. Human error created an apocalypse on a local scale, but fate decided to spare the participants of this drama. We saw how the earth can open up beneath our feet due to a single wrong number. The next story will prove that danger can come not from the depths, but from the past, which refuses to die. We will travel to the jungle, where time stood still for 3 decades for one stubborn man. Story number 3. The Ghost Who Refused to Surrender. Lubang Island, Philippines, February 1974. The jungle here is not just a forest. It is a living, breathing organism trying to digest you. The humidity is so high that the air is drinkable, and insects never cease their chatter. Tourists and locals feared venturing deeper into the jungle. Legends circulated about a spirit, a demon of war who knows no mercy. But it was not a spirit. It was Hiro Onoda. When he set foot on this island, the world was engulfed in the flames of World War II. He, a young intelligence officer, received a simple and terrifying order. You do not have the right to die. You do not have the right to surrender. It may take 3 years. It may take 5, but we will come back for you. Keep acting." And he acted. The problem was just one thing. The war had ended 29 years ago. For Onoda, time had stopped. All the leaflets dropped from planes announcing Japan's surrender he considered a clever trap by the enemy. The newspapers left by search parties he regarded as skillful forgeries. He lived in a state of combat readiness for nearly 3 decades. He fed on bananas and coconuts, stole rice from farmers, kept his rifle in perfect condition by oiling it with stolen oil, and patched his tattered uniform with threads made from wild plants. Every morning he woke up with the thought that he must protect the island for the emperor. The most incredible part of this story is not the survival itself, but how it ended. Onoda was not found by special forces or an army. He was discovered by a Japanese student dropout named Norio Suzuki. This guy set out on a journey with an absurd list of goals. He told his friends he was going to search for 3 things: a panda, Bigfoot, and Lieutenant Onoda. Suzuki located the lieutenant in just 4 days. When the thin, bearded, yet heavily armed ghost emerged from the bushes, the student was not afraid. He simply told the soldier that the war had long since ended. Japan was thriving, and the world had changed beyond recognition. Onoda listened, but his iron discipline was stronger than common sense. He replied, "I cannot leave. I have no orders from my commander." To end this war, one person had to make a journey through time. The Japanese government tracked down Major Taniguchi, Onoda's immediate commander. He had long since retired and was peacefully selling books. The former major was dressed in an old, mothball-scented uniform, put on a plane, and brought to the jungle. On March 9, 1974, a scene worthy of an ancient tragedy unfolded. The elderly bookseller stood before the thin old man in rags and read out the order to cease all hostilities. Onoda froze. His rifle, which had been an extension of his arm for 30 years, suddenly became just a piece of metal. He wept not from joy, but from the realization of terrible emptiness. 30 years of his life, his youth, his struggle, all for a war that did not exist. He emerged from the jungle as the last soldier of the empire, only to see a world where people flew on jetliners and watched color television. His loyalty to the oath made him a legend, but it also robbed him of his life. However, if blind obedience to rules in this story led to tragedy, then in our next chronicle, it was precisely the violation of the most stringent protocol that saved all humanity from becoming radioactive ash. Story number 4. The man who saved the world simply by doing nothing. The night of September 26, 1983. Moscow region. Secret bunker, Serpukhov 15. There is never any sunlight here. The air always smells of ozone and overheated electronics, and the silence is only broken by the hum of gigantic computing machines. This is the nerve center of the missile attack warning system. Colonel Stanislav Petrov is on duty at the console. The world was teetering on the edge that night. Relations between superpowers were stretched to the limit. Just 3 weeks earlier, a Korean Boeing had been shot down. Politicians exchanged threats, and the fingers of generals trembled over the red buttons. The air was electric. Everyone was waiting for the first strike. And suddenly, hell opened up right on the monitor screen. At 0:15, the siren wailed, loud, shrill, leaving no space for thoughts. On the main scoreboard, blood-red letters illuminated. Start. The system reported that an intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the territory of the United States. Target? The Soviet Union. Imagine being in Petrov's position. You have no time for a meeting. You have no right to panic. The instruction, composed by the smartest strategists, stated clearly. Upon detecting a launch, one must immediately report upwards, and from there, a command for a retaliatory strike would be issued. This meant the end of civilization. In just half an hour, the world as we know it would turn into a radioactive wasteland. The siren continued to wail. Operators in the room jumped from their seats, looking at Petrov. He was the only one who could make the decision. Then the system provided new data. The second missile, then the third, fourth, fifth. 5 nuclear missiles were on their way to kill millions of people. The computer gave a maximum degree of reliability, 100%. But Stanislav Petrov did what no algorithm could foresee. He froze. He began to think not like a soldier, but like an analyst. A thought raced through his mind. If the Americans decided to start a war, they wouldn't launch just 5 missiles. They would strike with their entire arsenal at once to annihilate us instantly. The launch of only 5 missiles was suicidal. It was illogical. Sweat poured into his eyes, and his heart beat somewhere in his throat. He held the telephone receiver of the government communication in his hands. All he needed to say was, "Missile attack confirmed." But he remained silent. Seconds ticked away, drawing closer the potential strike. He went against protocol, against the machine that was deemed infallible, against fear. He took a breath and firmly spoke into the receiver. "False information. I declare a false alarm." These were the longest minutes of his life. If he was wrong, then in 20 minutes, nuclear warheads would fall on Moscow, and he would become the man who allowed his country to be killed. He awaited the strike. The silence in the bunker was heavier than concrete. The strike did not come. Later, it was revealed that the smart technology had made a mistake. The satellite mistook sunlight reflected off high clouds for the launch of a missile. Nature played a cruel trick on technology, but the human factor, intuition, and the composure of one weary officer outplayed death. That night he saved the world, not by heroism in battle, but simply by refusing to believe in the inevitable. Stanislav Petrov spared us from engulfing fire. But our next story is dedicated to a girl who faced the complete opposite of heat. She survived a cold incompatible with life, transforming into an ice statue, only to return from the dead. Story number 5. The Girl Who Became Ice. Langby, Minnesota. The night of December 20th, 1980. Winter in these parts does not forgive mistakes. The wind here is such that it feels like it is trying to tear your skin off, and the temperature drops to levels where breathing catches in your throat. 15-year-old Jean Hilliard was returning home in her father's car. She was an ordinary girl who loved music and hanging out with friends. And that evening, her thoughts were occupied with Christmas plans, not fighting for her life. The road was slippery as glass. At one of the turns, the car slid off, and it gently but inevitably glided into a ditch. The engine stalled and showed no signs of life. Jean knew that her friend Wally lived just a few kilometers away. She made a logical decision: to walk there. She put on her cowboy boots, her coat, and stepped out into the night. She had no idea that the temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The wind pierced through her. Every step was a struggle. When she saw the lights of her friend's house, her strength had already faded. Her legs felt as heavy as lead, and her consciousness became hazy. She reached the driveway and fell down. Only 5 meters stood between her and the saving door. Jean lay in the snow for 6 hours. In the morning, Wally came out of his house and saw a strange object in the snow. As he approached, he screamed in horror. It was Jean, but she did not look human. She lay there with her eyes open, which had glazed over and stared vacantly. Her face was deathly pale, nearly gray. When Wally tried to lift her to put her in his car, he realized a horrifying truth. Jean was frozen so solidly that she had turned into a single piece of ice. He had to load her onto the back seat diagonally, like a mannequin from a store window or a frozen log. Her arms and legs were stuck in the position she had fallen. In the hospital, the doctors were in shock. They had seen frostbite before, but never anything like this. John's skin was so hard that medical needles bent and broke when attempting to give her an injection. The thermometer couldn't register her body temperature. It was below the lowest limit of the scale. Her pulse was difficult to detect. Her heart was beating only 12 times a minute instead of the normal 60. Her pupils did not react to light. Formally, from a medical standpoint, she was dead, or at least doomed. The doctors whispered that even if they managed to restart her heart, Her brain had surely died from lack of oxygen, and her legs would have to be amputated up to the hips, since the tissues were frozen solid. They covered her with electric heating pads. It was all they could do, wait and pray. Jean's mother sat by her bed, holding her daughter's icy hand, hoping for a miracle. And a miracle happened. After a few hours, the icy shell began to retreat. Jean moved. Then she opened her eyes and asked for a glass of water. The doctors could hardly believe their eyes. But the most incredible thing happened in the following days. Her legs, which had been black and hard, began to regain their color. Her brain had not been harmed in the slightest. After 49 days, Jean Hilliard was discharged from the hospital and walked home on her own 2 feet, having lost not even a single toenail. She completely thawed and returned to life, defying all known laws of biology. Jean cheated death, transforming into a statue. But the hero of our next story faced a situation where the cold would have been a blessing. He found himself trapped in a metal cage at the bottom of the ocean, in complete darkness, where air was dwindling to just a few hours, and there was no hope for rescue. Story number 6, The Chef Who Lived at the Bottom. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Nigeria, May 2013. The tug Eon 4 was an ordinary workhorse, engaged in routine tasks on the open sea. On board was a crew of 12 men, accustomed to rolling waves, salty winds, and hard labor. Among them was cook, 29-year-old Harrison Okine. That morning, he woke up early, before dawn, to prepare breakfast for the crew. He was in his underwear, standing in the bathroom and brushing his teeth. Suddenly, the world turned upside down. A massive wave slammed into the side of the small vessel. The tug tilted, screeched, and began to capsize rapidly. Water surged into the corridors like a raging beast. Harrison was thrown against the bulkhead. He heard the cries of his crewmates trying to escape their cabins, but the water was faster. The ship sank, taking the crew with it. It crashed to the seabed at a depth of 30 meters. Darkness, cold, and silence replaced the chaos, feeling like a death sentence. Harrison found himself trapped. He felt his way through the overturned corridor, grabbing onto pipes and ledges. The water rose to his throat. He found a cabin that seemed to have a bit more space and huddled in the corner. Something incredible happened. An air pocket formed in the hull of the overturned ship. A bubble of air trapped in the officer's cabin became the only chance for survival. Harrison sat on a box that once held Coca-Cola. The water was up to his chest. Around him was absolute pitch darkness. The cold penetrated to the bone. The water temperature at that depth was icy. He was wearing only his underwear. He knew the others were dead. He heard the fish begin to feast on the bodies of his friends somewhere in the neighboring compartments. It was the sound of a nightmare come true, splashing, slurping, and dull thuds against metal. Harrison was alone on the ocean floor in a tiny bubble of compressed air, slowly being poisoned by carbon dioxide. Hours passed, then days. He prayed, cried, sang psalms to keep from going insane. He didn't know if anyone was searching for him. The chances of anyone surviving a shipwreck underwater were practically non-existent. The divers sent to the crash site 3 days later were looking for bodies to return to their families. They were not searching for the living. Harrison heard a sound, a dull thud. At first, he thought it was sharks striking the hull, but the thud repeated. This was the sound of metal, and someone was outside that metal. He gathered his last strength, dove into the icy water, and swam toward the sound. He saw a beam of light, the diver's flashlight. Harrison reached out and touched the rescuer's shoulder. The diver recoiled in horror. Imagine searching for dead bodies on the ocean floor, and suddenly a hand reaches out from the darkness. The rescuer thought it was a corpse being tossed by the current, but the hand squeezed his fingers. A voice crackled over the radio, trembling with shock, saying, "He's alive! He's alive!" Harrison Okine spent 60 hours on the ocean floor, almost 3 days without food, water, in darkness and cold, breathing air that should have run out long before. Doctors later said it was a miracle, and physics, that saved him. Under pressure, Oxygen was absorbed differently, and the cold slowed his metabolism. But for Harrison himself, it was divine intervention. He was brought to the surface in a decompression chamber to prevent his blood from boiling due to the sudden change in pressure. When he saw the sun, he cried. Out of 12 people, only he survived, a cook who just happened to be in the right place at the right time, even if that place was the bottom of the ocean. The ocean released its victim, but sometimes danger comes from where we feel the safest, right in the heart of a civilized city, where the ground can turn as liquid as water. Story number 7. The tsunami that smelled like caramel. Boston, the RTN area, January 15, 1919. This day was unusually warm for winter. The snow was melting, the sun warmed the cobblestones, and the townspeople stepped outside, enjoying a break from the cold. Workers were having lunch, children played near the port facilities, and the cab drivers lazily urged their horses on. A sweet, cloying smell lingered in the air, one the locals had long gotten used to. The source of the scent was a giant tank belonging to the Purity Distilling Company, towering over the rooftops like a grim metal tower. Inside this tank, as tall as a 5-story building, was something that seemed completely harmless: molasses, a thick sugar syrup used for producing alcohol. In those days, there was a rush for alcohol before the prohibition took effect, and the tank was filled to the brim. 2,300,000 gallons of viscous, heavy liquid pressed against the steel walls. People often heard the tank groan. Sometimes syrup seeped from the seams, and children would rush over to collect the sweet drops with sticks. Nobody saw this as a threat because it was just syrup. After all, can syrup kill? Exactly at 12:40, a sound like a machine gun burst rang out. Steel rivets flew off, unable to withstand the pressure. A second later, the earth trembled with a deep, guttural roar. The giant tank simply disintegrated. What happened next defied common sense. Instead of water, a wall of black, sticky liquid 8 meters high crashed down on the city. But the most terrifying part was not the height, but the density. Molasses is 1.5 times heavier than water. It was not a wave, it was a moving rock, a liquid landslide that rushed through the streets at nearly 60 kilometers per hour. People had no chance to escape. The wave struck the fire station and shifted it from its foundation as if it were a cardboard box. It crushed the railway tracks on the overpass, and steel beams twisted like pretzels. Horses were pulled into the sticky abyss, unable to move. Eyewitnesses recalled this nightmare as a surreal painting. The world suddenly turned brown and viscous. People tried to swim, but molasses is not water. It sucks you in. The more you flail, the deeper you sink. Mouths and noses were clogged with the sweet mass, preventing a breath. When the wave settled, the area turned into a sticky swamp. Rescuers who arrived on the scene found themselves stuck in the syrup. They had to work for several days to retrieve the bodies of the deceased and assist the injured. 21 people lost their lives, and 150 were injured. The city was washed for months. Firefighters used seawater from the harbor to dissolve the crust that covered the houses and streets. Even decades later, locals swore that on hot summer days, a faint smell of caramel still emanated from the old brick buildings of North End. A ghost of a sweet apocalypse that proved even an innocuous dessert can become a weapon of mass destruction if there is too much of it. Boston's molasses was thick and suffocating, but our next story will take us within the sterile walls of a hospital where doctors encountered another kind of bodily fluid, human blood, that suddenly became as toxic as a chemical weapon. This is story number 8, the woman who became biological weaponry. The emergency room is a place where chaos is part of the routine. Doctors are used to blood, screams, and the smell of trouble. But what happened at Riverside Hospital in California on the evening of February 19, 1994, made even seasoned medical professionals believe in the mystical. That evening, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez was brought into the ward. She was suffering from terminal cancer. Her heart was beating irregularly. Breathing was labored. The medical team acted quickly and efficiently, trying to stabilize the patient. This was a standard procedure, repeated in hospitals thousands of times a day. No one present suspected that in just a few minutes, the patient herself would become a deadly threat to all trying to save her. Strangeness began when nurse Susan Kane removed Gloria's shirt to place defibrillator electrodes. She noticed that the woman's body was covered in a peculiar, oily sheen. Then the doctors caught a whiff of something. The smell coming from the patient's mouth was not of medicine, but rather a mix of fruity and garlicky odors. However, the true nightmare began when blood was drawn from Gloria for tests. Nurse Julia Gorczynski, taking the blood vial, noticed something impossible within it. In the dark red liquid, microscopic crystals floated, reminiscent of vanilla paper. The blood looked wrong. Julia brought the vial to her eyes, and that acted as a trigger. Suddenly, Susan Kane, standing by the IV, went pale and collapsed to the floor unconscious. The doctors rushed to her, but they immediately felt something was amiss themselves. Julia Gorczynski began to complain that her face was burning with fire. Within a minute, she lay on the floor convulsing and stopped breathing. The third victim was physician Marlene Welch. She lost control of her legs and blacked out. Panic erupted in the resuscitation section. People were falling, one after another, like bowling pins. Healthy, strong professionals were losing consciousness, feeling nauseous, and experienced spasms. It seemed that Gloria Ramirez's very presence, her breath, and her blood were poisoning the air around them. An internal alarm was declared. The emergency department, which should be the safest place in town, was urgently evacuated. Patients on stretchers were transported directly to the night parking lot. The doctors, still on their feet, stripped their colleagues to wash off the invisible toxin. An arriving hazmat team in suits resembling spacecraft suits combed the building for any gas leaks or toxins, but they found nothing. The air was clean. 23 staff members were injured. 5 were hospitalized. Julia Gorczynskaya spent 2 weeks in intensive care. She developed hepatitis, pancreatitis, and bone tissue necrosis, which almost left her disabled. What was this? Gloria Ramirez died that same night, but the mystery of her toxicity continues to spark debate. The most popular theory sounds like science fiction. It suggests that she used methylsulfonyl a home remedy for pain that she had applied to her body. Under the influence of oxygen provided through a mask and electrical discharges from a defibrillator, this substance in her blood underwent a monstrous chemical reaction, turning into a chemical warfare agent right inside her veins. Her body became a living chemical laboratory, producing a poison that should not have been there. Gloria Ramirez unwittingly became a threat to doctors, but the hero of our next story consciously put his head where death was guaranteed by the laws of physics. He gazed into the barrel of the most powerful device on the planet and received a blow that should have incinerated his brain, but instead granted him a strange form of immortality. Story number 9. The Man Pierced by the Beam of Infinity. This happened on July 13, 1978, in the science city of Protvino. Here, underground, the world's most powerful particle accelerator at that time, the U-70 synchrotron, was operating. This gigantic ring accelerated protons to speeds approaching that of light. The energy contained in this flow was colossal. This wasn't just the light of a flashlight. It was the concentrated fury of the universe trapped in a magnetic field. Young physicist Anatoly Bugorsky, 36 years old, was supposed to check a malfunctioning piece of equipment. The complex and multi-stage safety system, for some reason, failed. The light indicating that the accelerator was on burned out. The door that was supposed to be locked opened. Anatoly was sure that the channel was empty. He leaned in to look inside the vacuum tube where the detectors were. And in that moment, a beam of protons passed through his head. He felt nothing more. Later, he described it as, "I saw a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The flash was silent but blinding. It appeared not in front of his eyes but right inside his skull. A beam of particles just a couple of millimeters in diameter entered at the back of his head and exited through his nose." The radiation he received was measured not in familiar doses, but in astronomical quantities. A lethal dose for a human is about 500 Röntgen. Bugorsky received 200,000 Röntgen on entry, and due to beam scattering in the tissues, 300,000 on exit. It was like sticking his head into the throat of a functioning nuclear reactor. By all laws of radiobiology, he should have died instantly, turning into a charred doll, or, at best, lived for a couple of days in terrible agony as his brain disintegrated at the cellular level. Anatoly finished his work, noted the malfunction in the logbook, and went home. He told no one anything, although he understood that something terrible had happened. At night, the left side of his face swelled beyond recognition. It was only then that he turned to the doctors. He was urgently transported to a specialized clinic in Moscow. The doctors looked at him like a living corpse. They prepared his wife for the worst, predicting an imminent end. The skin at the entry and exit points of the beam began to peel away, exposing bone and tissue. It was a burn that had pierced through the brain. But Anatoly did not die. He did not lose his intellect. He did not become a vegetable. Moreover, he defended his dissertation after the incident. His brain, pierced by a beam of particles, found a way to rewire its connections and continue functioning. The only reminder of his encounter with the beam of infinity became his face. It turned into a mask of Dorian gray. The right side of his face aged as usual, becoming covered in wrinkles, while the left, penetrated by radiation, remained forever smooth, young, and motionless. The nerves were destroyed, but the tissue seemed to have been preserved in time. He is still alive, a man who survived a shot from a weapon designed to obliterate matter. Science cannot fully explain why he is alive. Perhaps the beam was so focused and swift that it pierced the tissues without having time to transfer all of its lethal energy. Anatoly Bugorsky became an exception to the rules of nuclear physics. But our next story is dedicated to a place where the rules were violated by nature itself. We will journey to a lake that killed all life around it in a single night, without spilling a drop of water or creating a single wave. Story number 10. The night when the air became the enemy. Cameroon, West Africa, August 21st, 1986. The village of No was preparing for sleep. It was a quiet, secluded place where life flowed steadily, following the rhythms of nature. Local farmers returned from the fields, women cooked dinner over an open fire, and children played in the dusty roads. Towering over the village was a mountain. Within its crater lay Lake Nyos. The lake had always been considered the benevolent spirit of the region. Its waters were deep blue, calm as a mirror. Legends spoke of ancestral spirits living in the lake, but no one feared them. That evening, nothing heralded disaster. There were no earthquakes, no hurricanes, no flashes of lightning. Nature was absolutely serene. Around 9 in the evening, the villagers heard a strange sound. It was not an explosion, but rather a deep, low rumble, reminiscent of distant thunder or the exhale of a giant beast. Yet the sky remained clear. People shrugged and continued with their activities, unaware that this sound was a signal for the beginning of one of the strangest and deadliest events in the planet's history. At that moment, Lake Nyos turned over. Deep underwater at the bottom of the crater, carbon dioxide had been accumulating for centuries, seeping from the magma. The water under immense pressure kept this gas trapped, just as a cork keeps champagne in a bottle. But that night, something, perhaps a landslide or cold rain, disturbed this fragile balance. A bubble burst free. A giant bubble of carbon dioxide erupted from the depths of the lake. The volume of the release exceeded 1 cubic kilometer of gas. The water in the lake foamed and surged in a column 100 meters high. The lake instantly changed color from blue to rusty red. Iron had risen from the bottom. But the most terrifying events began afterward. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. Breaking free, a gigantic invisible cloud soared into the sky. It poured over the crater's edge like water and descended in a dense, heavy flow into the valley where the villages slept. It was a silent river of death. The cloud moved at a speed of about 50 kilometers per hour and was 50 meters thick. It displaced oxygen, extinguishing everything in its path. The first to go were the campfires and kerosene lamps. The fire simply suffocated. Then the birds fell silent, and insects dropped to the ground. When the gas reached the village of Nyos, people didn't even have time to understand what was happening. They were not gasping in agony, nor were they coughing. They simply lost consciousness. Those who were sleeping never woke up. Those who sat at their doorsteps remained seated, as if lost in thought. Death came instantly and silently. The gas covered the valley like a thick blanket, killing all living things within a radius of 25 kilometers. On the morning of August 22nd, the survivors, located above the affected area, descended into the valley and beheld a sight that chilled them to the bone. There were no destroyed houses, no blood, no signs of struggle. The village looked as if time had stopped. Cows lay in the fields as if they were just resting. People lay in their beds. But there was an absolute ringing silence. Even the flies did not buzz. 1,746 people perished. 3,500 heads of cattle were lost. Scientists named this a limnological disaster, an event so rare that until that moment, only a few had heard of it. The lake that fed and quenched the people became their executioner in an instant, simply releasing the pent-up pressure. Nature demonstrated how easily it could take life, using an invisible gas pressed against the ground. But the hero of our next story challenged gravity in the most absurd and audacious way. He decided to ascend into the sky, not in an airplane or a rocket, but with something that could be bought at a regular hardware store. Story number 11. A pilot in a garden chair. Larry Walters always dreamed of flying, but fate had other plans. Poor eyesight closed the door to the U.S. Air Force for him. He became a truck driver, an ordinary guy from Los Angeles whose dreams seemed to have faded among the road dust and routine. But Larry was not one to give up. If the Army wouldn't give him wings, he would make them himself. On July 2, 1982, Larry decided to bring his crazy plan to life. His flying apparatus resembled nothing ever created by engineers. It was an ordinary aluminum garden chair with a woven seat, purchased at a supermarket for $10. He named it Inspiration 1. To this chair, he tied 42 weather balloons, each about 2 meters in diameter. Larry filled them with helium. As ballast, he attached empty water jugs to the chair legs. He took sandwiches, a couple of cans of beer, a radio, and an air gun with him. The plan was simple and naive. To ascend to the height of the treetops, about 10 meters, to fly around the backyard for a couple of hours, enjoying the view and beer, and then shoot a couple of balloons with the gun to gently descend. Larry settled into his chair, buckled up, checked his gun, and signaled his friends to cut the rope holding the ship to the ground. At that moment, physics played a cruel trick on him. He underestimated the lift of 42 helium balloons. Instead of rising smoothly above the roof, the chair shot into the sky like a cork from a bottle. The ascent speed was frightening, around 300 meters per minute. Larry pressed into the cheap woven seat. The ground rapidly faded away. 10 meters, no, 100 meters, still not enough. The chair continued to soar upward until it reached an altitude of 16,000 feet. That's almost 5 kilometers. Imagine this surreal scene. A truck driver in a t-shirt and shorts, sitting in a garden chair, dangling in the stratosphere. The temperature dropped to below zero. The air became thin. It was hard to breathe. Larry was frozen in terror and cold. He was afraid to shoot the balloons, fearing that the entire structure would lose balance and he would plummet down like a stone. The most incredible moment occurred when a gust of wind carried him into the flight corridor of Los Angeles International Airport. The pilot of a TWA passenger aircraft, preparing to land, rubbed his eyes in disbelief. He contacted the dispatcher with a trembling voice. "Tower, this is TWA. We have visual contact with an object." "What type of object?" asked the dispatcher. "It's a guy in a garden chair with a gun in his hand," replied the pilot. The dispatchers thought the pilot had gone crazy. But a few minutes later, another plane from Delta Airlines confirmed, "Yes, we see the guy in the chair too." Larry drifted in the sky for several hours. Finally, realizing that he would either be struck by an airplane or freeze to death, he mustered his courage and began shooting at the balloons. Slowly, very slowly, the chair started to descend. The landing was rough. The ropes of the balloons tangled in power lines, leaving a whole area of Long Beach without electricity for 20 minutes. Larry yelped just a few feet from the ground. When firefighters rescued him, he was immediately arrested by the police. Reporters were waiting for him on the ground. One asked, "Larry, why did you do this?" The truck driver, still trembling from the cold but proud, replied with a phrase that became legendary. "Well, a man can't just sit still." He paid a fine, but entered history as the only person to rise into the stratosphere on furniture. Larry sought adventure in the sky, but our next story is about people who wanted only one thing: to return home across the cold ocean, only to find themselves at the mercy of their own rescuer. Story number 12. The Ship That Refused to Die. The Arctic Ocean, off the coast of Alaska, October 1931. Winter in the Arctic sets in abruptly. It falls upon the world like a heavy curtain. The shipping route Beichimo, a powerful steel vessel weighing 1,300 tons, was battling through ice fields with a cargo of fur. The crew dreamed of only one thing: reaching Vancouver to warmth and home comfort. But the ocean had other plans. The icy trap closed suddenly. Huge ice floes, like the jaws of a white giant, crushed against the hull of the ship. The engines roared, but the vessel could not budge an inch. The captain made a decision that turned out to be the only right one: to wait it out. The crew disembarked onto the ice and built a temporary shelter on the shore, just 1 kilometer from the stranded ship. They believed that the ice would recede. At the end of November, a monstrous snowstorm broke out. The wind howled with such force that the people in the shelter could not hear their own thoughts. Visibility dropped to 0. When the storm subsided and the horizon cleared, the sailors looked towards the ocean and froze. Where the Beichimo once stood was only an icy wasteland. The giant steel mountain was gone. The captain and crew logically concluded. During the storm, the ice had crushed the hull and the ship had sunk. They mourned the loss of their cargo, awaited the rescue planes, and flew home, convinced that Beichimo would find its rest in the ocean grave. But a week later, a strange report came in. An Eskimo hunter claimed to have seen the ship. It was drifting 70 kilometers from the site of its demise. It was intact, it was empty, and it was sailing. Thus began one of the most incredible maritime legends of the 20th century. Beichimo became the ghost ship of the Arctic. The crew abandoned it, deeming it doomed, but the ship proved to be more resilient than the people. Without a captain, without mechanics, without a single living soul on board, it continued on its way. Over the next 38 years, think about that number, almost 4 decades, Beichimo was sighted dozens of times. In 1933, a group of storm chasers even boarded it. They found the vessel in perfect condition. In the cabins lay books, and in the holds were preserved pelts. They wanted to tow it away, but suddenly a storm swept in once more, separating the people and the ship, which fiercely defended its freedom. In 1939, another captain attempted to board it, but the ice began to rapidly encroach, threatening to crush his own ship. The vessel survived World War II, drifting through waters where military convoys sank. It survived the atomic age. It became part of folklore. Local residents of Alaska often saw its silhouette in the fog, rusted, icy, but proudly moving against the current. The last sighting of it was in 1969. It was trapped in the ice again, but it looked unbeaten. No one knows where it is now. Perhaps it has finally found peace at the bottom. Or perhaps it is still out there, in the white silence, proving that creations of human hands can occasionally possess their own unfathomable will to live. Beichimo vanished into the icy fog, taking its secrets with it. But our next story will transport us from the cold emptiness to a crowded, noisy city, where a theft occurred that was so bold and strange that the police long considered it a hoax. Story number 13, The Perfect Crime in the Rain. Tokyo, the morning of December 10, 1968. The sky over the Japanese capital was heavy, leaden, and an endless cold drizzle poured down on the city. The streets of the Futu district glistened with water as people buried their faces in their collars, hurrying about their business. On that gray, unwelcoming day, a nondescript bank cash truck from Nipponis made its way down the road. Inside the vehicle were 4 employees. They were carrying a load upon which the mood of thousands of people depended. Christmas bonuses for the workers of the Toshiba factory. Inside metal containers lay almost 300 million yen. At that time, this was an astronomical sum, capable of ensuring a comfortable life for several generations. The atmosphere in the vehicle was tense, but not because of the money. A few days earlier, the bank manager had received a letter with a bomb threat. The police were on high alert. The instructions were strict. So when the cash collectors saw a lone police motorcycle emerging through the rain in their rearview mirror, they were not surprised. A white helmet, uniform, and flashing siren. This was authority that one was expected to obey without question in Japan. The motorcyclist pulled alongside the vehicle and, with a firm gesture, ordered the driver to stop. The cash collectors pulled over to the side of the road. The officer, without removing his helmet, hurried to the window. He looked anxious. His voice was nearly a shout. An urgent message from the precinct. The home of your bank manager has just been blown up. We have information that there is also a bomb in your vehicle. Everyone exit immediately. The words fell on prepared soil. Fear of the terrorist who had already sent threats paralyzed logic. 4 employees jumped out of the vehicle into the pouring rain, leaving the money unattended. The impersonator slipped beneath the vehicle. A second later, a hissing sound was heard, and dense smoke mixed with sparks billowed from under the car. "An explosion is inevitable," he yelled, waving his arms. "Run! Lie on the ground! I will try to defuse it!" The cash collectors, engulfed in panic, scattered in search of shelter behind concrete barriers. They covered their heads with their hands, bracing for fiery hell. Amidst the sound of the rain and the beating of their own hearts, they could hear the heroic officer dealing with the bomb. Then they heard the sound of an engine. One of the employees cautiously peeked out from their hiding place. He saw a scene that seemed like an absurd hallucination. The policeman calmly sat in the driver's seat of the cash collector's vehicle, shifted into gear, and drove off slowly, vanishing into the rain-soaked haze. There was no dynamite under the car. Only a standard signal flare was burning, which had created the smokescreen. It was the boldest robbery in Japan's history. The criminal did not use a weapon. He did not resort to violence. He did not utter a single rude word. He stole 300 million yen, using only a cheap flare, a stolen motorcycle painted white, and the power of human trust in a uniform. The investigation became the largest in the country's history. 110,000 people made the list of suspects. The police processed 170,000 pieces of evidence. Millions of flyers with a composite sketch of the man in the helmet were printed, but the criminal seemed to have evaporated. He left no fingerprints. Everything abandoned at the crime scene was mass-produced. He calculated everything, down to the psychology of the victims. The statute of limitations for the crime expired in 1975. The robber was never found, and no one knows how he spent his fortune. He committed the perfect crime, simply playing the role expected of him. This man used his intelligence to outsmart the system and disappear as a wealthy man. But the hero of our next story faced the opposite challenge. He was a simple vagrant whom the system desperately wanted to kill for insurance money, yet he turned out to be the most resilient man on earth. Story number 14. Mike, who cannot be killed. New York, the height of the Great Depression, 1933. Times were harsh, people were starving, and survival took precedence over morality. In one of the underground bars of the Bronx, a group of conspirators gathered. They were not the masterminds of the criminal world, but petty crooks. The bar owner, Antonio Marina, along with a funeral director, bartender, and taxi driver, hatched a devilish plan. Their target was Michael Malone, a local vagrant, an Irishman, an alcoholic, who seemed to live solely for the next shot of whiskey. Mike had neither family, nor home, nor future. The conspirators decided to insure his life for a large sum and then help him pass away. The plan seemed perfect. Mike was already drinking nonstop. They simply needed to let him drink himself to death. Antonio Marina extended an unlimited credit line to Mike, who couldn't believe his luck. He sat in the bar from morning till night, pouring whiskey into himself by the liter. The conspirators waited, a day, 2 days, a week, but Mike didn't die. On the contrary, he looked more lively than ever. Then, they decided to change their tactics. The bartender began to mix antifreeze into his alcohol. A normal person would have died from just a sip, but Mike drank it all, asked for more, and then sang an Irish song before falling asleep on the table. In the morning, he awoke without the slightest signs of a hangover and asked to drink again. In desperation, the conspirators resorted to extreme measures. They started adding rat poison and even finely ground glass to his drinks. They fed him sandwiches with rotten oysters and metal shavings. Mike consumed everything and drank it all. His stomach seemed made of iron, and his liver functioned on nuclear fuel. He thanked his friends for their generosity and kept on living. Iron Mike, as he was whispered to be called, was becoming a problem. The insurance premiums had to be paid, but the client refused to die. One snowy winter night, when the temperature dropped to 25 degrees below zero, they got Mike drunk to the point of unconsciousness, drove him to the park, dumped him in a snowdrift, doused him with water, and left him to freeze. In the morning, they were sure their job was done. But by evening, the bar door opened, and Mike appeared on the doorstep, shivering, sneezing, and complaining, "Damn, it's chilly today. Pour me something warm." It was no longer funny. It was frightening. The group of killers began to believe they were dealing with some dark force. Eventually, they decided to take a more brutal approach. They hired a taxi driver who hit Mike with the car at full speed. The vagrant flew over the hood, hit the pavement, and went quiet. The killers drove away, convinced they had succeeded. Mike vanished from the bar. A week went by. The conspirators were preparing to collect the insurance when a local patrol officer entered the bar and shared some news. Some vagrant had been hit by a car. He had suffered fractures but was on the mend in the city hospital. Mike Malloy survived poisons, glass, cold, and a hit by a vehicle weighing 1,500 kilograms. He was only killed on the seventh attempt, in the most primitive way, with a gas hose held to his mouth while he slept. But retribution caught up with the gang in an instant. Their greed and foolishness doomed them. They began to quarrel over money, and rumors reached the police. All four ended their lives in the electric chair, while Michael Malloy became an urban legend, a man who loved to drink so much that even death could not tear him from the bar. Iron Mike was invulnerable thanks to some mystical force, but the hero of the next story possessed a strength that was quite real and tangible. He was a giant, whose body became both his gift and his curse, and who once hid in his pocket something that could not fit in the trunk of a car. Story number 15. The Giant with the Heart of a Child. Paris, early 20th century. In an era when the world was still amazed by physical anomalies, André René Roussimoff was a true marvel of nature. You probably know him as André the Giant, a wrestling legend. But this story is not about fights in the ring. It is about how a man whose size frightened those around him turned out to be the kindest creature in the world of show business. André suffered from acromegaly, a condition in which the growth hormone never stops being produced. He was enormous. His height was 2 meters 24 centimeters, and he weighed 240 kilograms. His fingers were as thick as sausages, and his palm could cover the face of an adult completely. Ordinary things like chairs, cars, and doorways were tools of torture for him. But behind this mountain of muscle lay the soul of a poet. Writer Samuel Beckett, a Nobel Prize laureate, lived next to André's family when he was a teenager. Since André already couldn't fit in the school bus, Beckett would drive him to school in his truck, and they would talk for hours about cricket. However, the most incredible story that showcases the scale of André's personality in every sense occurred in a bar. Like Mike Malloy from the previous story, André loved to drink, but his capacity was beyond human comprehension. One evening, André entered a hotel bar in Pennsylvania. He was in a bad mood, or perhaps just wanted to relax. He sat at the bar, of course, on a specially reinforced chair, and began to drink beer. Over 6 hours, André the Giant drank 119 cans of beer. This is not a typo. 119 cans, each 350 milliliters, equals more than 40 liters of liquid. An ordinary person would have died from water intoxication, not to mention alcohol poisoning. But for Andre, it was just a casual evening. He consumed all that, paid the bill, and simply fell asleep in a chair in the hotel lobby. The staff found themselves in a difficult position. No one dared to wake the giant. Carrying him was impossible. He weighed as much as 2 adult lions. In the end, the hotel manager made the only right decision. They covered the sleeping Andre with a velvet rope, like a museum exhibit, and let him sleep until morning. Guests walked by with awe, gazing at the snoring mountain. But Andre's strength manifested not only in his ability to consume drinks. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was not a small man himself, told an unbelievable story. One evening, they were dining at a restaurant. When the bill arrived, Arnold attempted to pay. Andre, who believed that the guests should not pay, said in a deep voice, "I'll pay." Arnold started to argue. At that point, Andre simply stood up, silently lifted the Terminator with one hand like a puppet, carried him out of the restaurant, and gently placed him on the roof of his own car. Then he returned, paid the bill, and walked out smiling. Arnold remained seated on the roof, realizing that there is a force in the world that it is futile to argue against. Andre lived in a world that was too fragile for him. He constantly feared breaking something or hurting someone. His life was short, but he left a mark not only with dents on the floor, but also in the hearts of people, proving that being a great man means having a big heart. Andre could be seen from a mile away. But the heroes of the next story, in contrast, did everything to become invisible. They created a whole army that existed solely to deceive the enemy, and their weapons were not guns, but rubber and plywood. Story number 16. The Ghost Army. World War II, Europe. While real cannons roared and blood flowed on the front lines, a secret unit operated behind the lines of the Allies, known only to a few. Officially, they were called the 2nd Special Service Force, but history remembers them by another name, the Ghost Army. This unit didn't have snipers or saboteurs. Instead of rifles, they were armed with brushes, paints, sound recording equipment, and acting skills. They recruited artists, designers, sound engineers, and architects from the best art schools in New York and Philadelphia. Their mission was both crazy and brilliant, to make the Germans believe in the existence of a massive army that didn't actually exist. Their main weapon was inflatable tanks. Imagine a field somewhere in France. A German reconnaissance plane flies over a forest and takes photos. In the pictures, the German command sees a column of Sherman tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. In a panic, the Germans moved divisions there, preparing for an attack. But on the ground, those tanks weighed only 40 kilograms. 4 soldiers could lift one of those tanks and carry it over a fence. If an inflatable tank was hit with shrapnel, they simply patched it up like a bicycle tire. But the visual deception was just part of the show. The Ghost Army created a symphony of war. Engineers recorded the sounds of moving armored vehicles, the clank of tracks, the shouts of sergeants, and the noise of bridge construction on massive wire tape recorders. Using giant speakers mounted on trucks, they transmitted these sounds towards the enemy. The sound could be heard from 20 kilometers away. The Germans heard the approach of a tank division, trembled in fear, but no one came to them in the darkness. The acting was perfected. The soldiers of the Ghost Army donned the uniforms of other units with the insignia of generals and went into local bars in liberated cities. There, they accidentally spoke about their offensive plans, knowing that enemy spies were listening. They drove their jeeps in circles, creating the illusion of endless columns, leaving tracks in the mud. The boldest performances were staged in March 1945 on the Rhine River. While the real Ninth Army prepared for a crossing in one location, the Phantoms put on a grand show 15 kilometers to the south. They inflated 600 tanks and guns, cranked up the sound systems to full power, and even simulated flashes of artillery fire. The Germans fell for it. They redirected all their forces to the site of the fake crossing, firing on rubber decoys. Thanks to this deception, the actual crossing took place with virtually no losses. The Ghost Army saved, according to historians, between 15 and 30,000 lives of real soldiers. They fought not with bullets, but with imagination. After the war, their feat was classified for 50 years. Artists returned to their easels, designers to fashion, Many of them became celebrities like the designer Bill Blass. But until the end of the 1990s, they were not allowed to tell even their wives that they once inflated tanks and frightened Nazis with sounds from speakers. The illusion saved thousands of lives, but in the next story, we will confront a reality that was scarier than any fiction. This is the story of a town that burned from within for half a century, and land that became too hot to live on. Story number 17. The town where the earth burns beneath your feet. Pennsylvania, the town of Centralia, May 1962. It was a typical American mining town. Neat white houses, Sunday school, friendly neighbors. Life here revolved around anthracite coal, which was dug deep underground. The residents were preparing for Memorial Day and decided to tidy up the town dump. The town council hired 5 volunteer firefighters to burn the garbage in an abandoned coal mine shaft. They had done this before. The procedure seemed routine. They set fire to the pile, waited for it to burn down, and doused the ashes with water. It seemed like the job was done, but they did not know that the fire had not gone out. It had simply gone deeper. The smoldering coals found their way through cracks in the spoil to the abandoned coal tunnels. Beneath the town lay a labyrinth of mines filled with remnants of coal and wooden supports. The fire, like a predator sensing blood, latched onto this endless source of fuel. At first, the residents noticed nothing, but soon, strange things began to happen. A foul smell of sulfur appeared in the basements. The asphalt on the roads became warm, even on frosty days. In winter, the snow in Centralia melted as soon as it touched the ground, while the grass remained unnaturally green. The true scale of the disaster revealed itself nearly 20 years later, on Valentine's Day in 1981. 12-year-old Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet opened up. A sinkhole formed, more than a meter wide. Todd grabbed a tree root, screaming desperately. His cousin managed to pull him out just a second before he would have fallen into the abyss. When they later measured the depth of the hole, it was 46 meters. But the most terrifying part was not the depth, but the heat. A torrent of deadly carbon monoxide surged from the depths of the crater. The temperature there reached several hundred degrees. It turned out that beneath the town, an enormous underground fire was raging. The flame spread over an area of 1,500 acres. It consumed coal seams, slowly roasting the town from below. Authorities tried to extinguish the fire, drilling wells and pouring tons of water, sand, and fly ash, but the underground monster only laughed at these efforts. Water evaporated, turning into steam, which tore the earth apart with new fissures. Highway number 61 cracked like an old plate, and acrid smoke poured from the crevices. In 1984, the government admitted defeat. It was impossible to put out the fire. An unprecedented decision was made to evacuate the entire town. Homes were bought up and bulldozed, and the streets emptied. The postal code 17,927 was officially canceled. Today, Centralia is a ghost town. Almost no buildings remain, only a network of old roads leading nowhere, and a cemetery that curiously was not touched by the fire. But the earth still smolders. Experts say there is enough coal underground to keep the fire burning for another 250 years. This town has become the inspiration for nightmares in films and games, but for its former residents, it was a tragedy of losing a home that literally burned beneath their feet while they slept. The fire underground cannot be stopped, but the next story will tell of a force capable of halting even time itself. We will move to an operating room where a man's heart had been silent for so long that medicine was ready to sign a death certificate. But life found a loophole. Story number 18, The Man Without a Pulse. Aha! United States, August 2013. Tony Ahal, a diesel truck driver, woke in the middle of the night from a strange sensation. He felt as if someone was squeezing his chest with an iron band. His breathing became labored. The world faded to black. His wife, Melissa, noticing her husband's unnatural complexion and hearing wheezing, immediately called for an ambulance. When the medics arrived, Tony's heart had already stopped. He was taken to Kettering Medical Center. The doctors began the standard resuscitation procedure. The defibrillator delivered shocks, trying to restart the engine. They administered adrenaline and performed chest compressions, but the monitor displayed a flat line. Asystole. Death. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. According to all medical protocols, a person's brain begins to irreversibly die after 5 to 7 minutes without oxygen. After 30 minutes of resuscitation, hope usually disappears. But the doctors continued the fight. 45 minutes. Tony's heart was silent. His skin had turned gray, and his pupils dilated, unresponsive to light. Cardiologist Dr. Raja Nazir looked at the clock. 45 minutes had passed since the heart had stopped. Continuing resuscitation made no sense. It would be simply cruel to the body. Dr. Nazir exited to speak with the family. He said the most dreadful words a wife and son could hear. "We did everything we could. Tony has died. I am so sorry." Melissa and their son Lawrence entered the room to say goodbye. Tony's body lay motionless, entangled in tubes and wires that had already been disconnected from the machines. The silence in the room was deafening. Lawrence, a grown man, could not hold back his tears. He approached his father, placed his hand on his chest, and said, "Dad, you can't die today. Not today." In that moment, a few minutes after the official announcement of death, Lawrence suddenly felt something strange beneath his palm. A faint, barely perceptible pulse. He shouted, "Doctor, he is breathing. I can feel his heart." Dr. Nazir returned to the room, convinced that this was either a hallucination of grief-stricken relatives or residual muscle reflexes. He reluctantly glanced at the monitor, and then he froze. On the screen, where there had been a flat line for almost an hour, a weak but rhythmic spike appeared. Beep. Pause. Beep. Tony Yala's heart, which had been silent for 45 minutes, suddenly decided to restart all on its own, without electricity, without massage, without medication, simply from the touch of his son. In medicine, this is known as the Lazarus phenomenon, the spontaneous return of circulation after the cessation of resuscitation. It is such a rare occurrence that each case is described in scientific journals as a miracle. But the most astonishing part was yet to come. Typically, after such a prolonged clinical death, people, if they do survive, remain in a vegetative state due to the death of brain cells. The doctors prepared the family for the fact that Tony would never know them again and would be unable to speak. Tony woke up a few days later. He opened his eyes, looked at his crying wife, and asked why there were so many people around. His brain was completely intact. He remembered everything, except for the moment of death. Within a couple of weeks, he was discharged from the hospital with a pacemaker in his chest, returning to a normal life. Dr. Nazir later confessed to reporters, "I am a cardiologist. I believe in science, but what happened that day I can explain only as divine intervention or the power of love that defied the laws of physiology. Tony's heart returned from the dead. But in the next story, we will learn about a man whose body became a prison. He was trapped inside himself, hearing and seeing everything, but unable to even blink to tell the world, 'I'm here. I'm still alive.'" Story number 19. The Prisoner of His Own Body. South Africa, the late 1980s. Martin Pistorius was an ordinary 12-year-old boy who loved electronics and dreamed of the future. But one day, he returned home from school with a sore throat. The doctor said it was the flu, but he continued to get worse. He stopped eating. Then he stopped walking. And soon, his mind began to fade. The doctors diagnosed him with cryptococcal meningitis and tuberculosis of the brain. Martin's condition rapidly deteriorated. Soon he fell into a coma. The doctors told his parents, "Take him home. He's a vegetable. His mind is gone. Only his body remains. Care for him until he dies." The prognosis was 2 years to live. But Martin did not die. His body continued to live, while his mind slept. His parents fed him through a tube, turned him every 2 hours to prevent bed sores, washed him, and dressed him. To the outside world, he was an empty shell. About 4 years passed, and then something unimaginable happened. Martin woke up. Not physically. His body remained paralyzed. He couldn't move a finger or an eye, but his consciousness had returned. It ignited brightly and clearly. He understood everything. He could see, hear, and smell, but he was trapped in a concrete sarcophagus of his own flesh. Imagine that horror. You're lying in a room. You see the sun moving across the wall. You hear conversations of your loved ones. You want to scream, "Mom, I am here. I hear you." But your lips do not move. Your lungs do not take in air to cry out. You are completely and utterly helpless. Martin spent nearly 10 years in this locked-in syndrome. He heard everything. He overheard how his mother, driven to despair after years of caring for a hopeless invalid, once whispered, looking at him, "I hope you die." Those words shattered his heart, but he couldn't even cry. He understood her pain, but couldn't comfort her. To avoid going insane, he learned to live inside his own head. He observed the movement of shadows. He counted seconds. He learned to tell time by how the light fell. He engaged in complex dialogues with himself. His mind became his only universe. Salvation came by chance. Aromatherapist Virna Vanderwald, who came to give massages, noticed a barely perceptible glimmer in Martin's eyes. "I feel he is there," she told his parents. She insisted that Martin be taken to the Alternative Communication Center at the University of Pretoria. His skeptical parents agreed. At the center, sensors were placed on Martin and they asked him to perform simple commands with his eyes, and he did it. The computer recorded activity. The doctors were stunned. Inside the vegetable lived a conscious person. This discovery was explosive. Martin was given a special computer that he could control with his eye movements. The first words he wrote were ones of gratitude. Martin Pistorius not only returned to life, he eagerly embraced it. He learned to read and write again. He graduated from college with honors. He learned to drive a specially equipped car. He started his own web design company. And perhaps the most incredible thing, he found love. He met a girl named Joanna. They got married and moved to the United Kingdom. In 2018, they welcomed a son. The man who had been written off, deemed dead while alive, proved that the human spirit cannot be crushed, even when the body refuses to cooperate. His story is a hymn to patience and faith, that even in the deepest darkness, there is a spark of consciousness. Martin escaped from the prison of silence, but the hero of our next story voluntarily went into captivity in the wilderness to live among the most dangerous predators of Alaska, and he paid a terrible price for his naivete. Story number 20, The Bear Man. Timothy Treadwell was a man who hated civilization. He considered society to be deceitful, cruel, and empty. His soul yearned for the purity that he believed could only be found in the wild, and he found his calling in Alaska, in Katmai National Park, among the giant grizzly bears. Timothy was not a scientist. He had no formal education in biology. He was a self-taught enthusiast with a camera and a fiery gaze. For 13 years, every summer he traveled to Alaska and lived in a tent right in the middle of bear trails, without weapons, without pepper spray, without electric fences. His philosophy was simple and naively frightening. If you love animals, if you respect them and are not afraid, they will accept you as one of their own. He gave the bears funny names: Mr. Chocolate, Aunt Melissa, Sergeant Brown. He would approach them within arm's length, sing them songs, and talk to them as if they were children. "Who's our good bear? I love you. I will protect you." The video footage he left behind shows him touching the nose of a 300-kilogram predator. The bears looked at him with surprise, sometimes with irritation, but did not touch him. Timothy believed in his invulnerability. He thought of himself as a man-bear, a mediator between worlds. But nature does not understand friendship in the human sense. In nature, there are only instincts: hunger, territorial defense, reproduction. Timothy broke the cardinal rule. He blurred the line between observer and predator. In October 2003, Timothy and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, stayed in the park longer than usual. Bears become aggressive during this time. They need to gain fat before hibernation. Timothy's usual friends had already gone to sleep, and unfamiliar hungry males descended into the valley, not knowing the kind man with the camera. On the 5th of October, a bush pilot who arrived to pick up the couple saw a torn-up campsite. The tent was collapsed, and a huge, old bear with damaged teeth was wandering around. Later it was revealed that Timothy had become a victim of his own illusion. The camera found at the scene of the tragedy was recording at the moment of the attack. The lens cap was closed, but the sound was recorded. This was the audio recording of the last 6 minutes of Timothy and Amy's lives. On the tape, Timothy can be heard screaming that he's being attacked. He asks Amy to hit the bear with a frying pan, but a grizzly is a killing machine. There was no chance. The most terrifying aspect of this story is that the bear did not see Timothy as a friend who betrayed him. The bear saw him merely as a slow, weak source of protein that had lingered in front of it for too long. Timothy Treadwell wanted to become part of the wild, and nature accepted him, literally digesting him and making him part of the food chain. His death was a brutal reminder. Love for nature should not replace respect for its laws. A predator remains a predator, no matter what affectionate names you give it. Timothy sought harmony in the forest. Now, our next story will take us into a world where harmony is created by mathematics and luck. We will tell you about a man who found a flaw in the world's most popular lottery and legally robbed it of millions using simple arithmetic.